Welcome to Larkin-Gowan Insights, accountancy and business advice for all, a series that gives you bite-sized tips and guidance on tax, funding, legislation, reforms and much more. With case studies, business advisory and sector specials and even interviews, our team of experts are committed to helping you navigate the world of accounting and finance with a variety of presenters from across our specialisms. So, let's get on with today's show.
Welcome to this special mini-series, Beyond the Barn, the Business of Farming. I'm your host, Laura Clayton, an Assistant Manager in the Farms and Rural Business team. In each episode, I invite a different guest to share their expertise on an array of different business topics that affect the farming and rural community. We cover tax, obviously, legal matters, succession, inheritance, and much more. We go behind the scenes of how we support our clients and hopefully give you some tips along the way. On today's episode, we are talking about planning reforms, and I'm joined by Stephen Rudd from Larkin-Gowan and Emma Griffiths from Brown&Co. Thank you both for joining. Please, would you mind introducing yourselves to our listeners?
Thanks, Laura. So I'm Stephen Rudd from Larkin-Gowan. So I'm a partner in our Farms and Rural Business team. I've been Larkin-Gowan 30 odd years, sort of dealing with clients in this sector and this industry. So lots of practical experience, hopefully to share with you on this podcast.
And I'm Emma Griffiths. I'm a chartered planner working at Brown&Co. Given the wider rural nature of our business, we do a lot of kind of rural diversification and development projects. So lots of experience here.
Should be lots to talk about then.
Yeah.
So Emma, could you please give us a bit of an update or an overview of the changes that have happened to the planning law reforms?
Yeah, so there's been a lot happen recently and there's still lots to come. So I think without talking about everything, last year we had some fairly big changes to permitted development rights, particularly in rural locations, especially in terms of the floor area for new agricultural buildings and the areas for changes of use of existing agricultural buildings to commercial premises or residential dwellings. And so they came into force last year, and any transitional arrangements have now ended. So they're the go-to for any new PD changes of use now. We also had some fairly big changes to the National Planning Policy Framework towards the end of last year, which have changed a lot of the council's requirements for the delivery of housing, mainly increasing numbers. Some areas it's resulted in a decrease, but predominantly those numbers have gone up, and that's had kind of short-term impacts for housing land supply and short-term opportunities for development, and then it'll have some longer-term impacts for new local plans moving forward. The government have been working over the last year or so on the land use framework. So that's a really kind of detailed and accurate recording of land use across the country. And that will be used moving forward to help inform the planning process. It has said that it won't dictate where development can and can't go, but I think it's definitely going to be used, especially where we're talking about protecting the most valuable agricultural land. Is really giving a guide on the areas that councils want to see protected against new development and loss of those areas. There's going to be a publication of that later this year, so watch this space on that. Then also later this year there should be a consultation on the National Development Management Policies. So that's going to be a series of policies that will have primacy over the local plan on those areas which kind of all councils grapple with. So it's going to especially be on areas like contamination, etc., to make sure that there's a uniform policy approach to those areas. So I don't think that will have a massive impact, but there will be some changes there with those shifting to a national level. And then we've also got the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which has now gone to the House of Lords for them to do their first reading. And that's looking at some fairly significant changes to the planning system with the aim of speeding up and simplifying the process. And there's a lot of changes in there around the way that planning committees work and training for members of planning committees, some widening of CPO powers and the removal of hope value, where parish councils and town councils are looking at doing affordable housing development, and introduced fairly late on the creation of a national ecology restoration fund, which seeks to simplify the process around specialist technical surveys, things like great crested newts and bats, in a similar way that the GRAMS fund works, where everyone pays into a central pot and then Natural England deliver some kind of wider restoration schemes, opposed to everything being on a project by project basis. So lots of change and still lots more to come.
So there's definitely plenty going on.
Yeah.
And simplifying things can only be a good thing for our clients.
Certainly, Laura. Yeah, welcome change if it actually comes to fruition. I think like a lot of these projects, they take an awful lot of time and therefore money and cost. So again, anything that simplifies the process, I'm sure will be welcome by clients.
Have any of your clients, Steve, mentioned about the changes impacting them, or if they're looking at doing things now that processes should be made simpler?
Like most of our clients, Laura, I think it's a very entrepreneurial sector really, and certainly where sort of the main farming returns have been over the last few years, lots of clients are having to look at diversification and different projects. It's always on the agenda, certainly at client meetings. I think it's really important, if we can get to this point where this process is simplified, then I think it's just going to help clients enormously in terms of being able to think through some of these projects that they've got on the go and actually get signed, sealed and delivered. Be really great.
The less red tape, the better.
Perfect, yeah.
And Emma, in terms of residential and commercial, are there any sort of differences? Is one easier than the other?
Yeah, so I think in terms of whether one is easier than the other, it really depends on a whole heap of things. What the actual circumstances, where it's located, what you're trying to achieve, whether you're looking at new builds or conversions, whether you're looking at utilising permitted development rights or planning policies. I think in a really broad, don't hold me to this, typically commercial tends to be slightly easier, mainly where we're talking about the utilisation of existing buildings. The councils tend to have planning policies which are supportive of that over residential development. Where they've got support for residential development, it's usually caveated on the basis that you've first shown that commercial development wouldn't work. And so purely from that perspective, especially when we're talking about using local plan policies opposed to permitted development rights, then commercial development is slightly easier. That being said, when we're looking at new build development in kind of rural locations, residential or commercial, those both tend to be fairly tricky and each have their hurdles. Commercial does tend to be new build commercial does tend to be slightly easier, especially where we're talking about diversification or the expansion of existing businesses in those areas. There tends to be more support for that than just straight new build commercial.
So you've seen a whole range go on
A whole range, and yeah, it's very circumstance and location dependent, and again council as well as the actual location, and some are slightly more supportive than others.
I mean, I'm sure you both have watched Clarkson's Farm, but obviously that was a big case there with the council as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a particularly extreme example, but it's also, I think, an example that if you ask any planner who's done a rural application kind of similar to that, they've got at least one project that has gone like that, and it doesn't really appear to matter all of the benefits that you might bring. Once the council decides that they don't want to support it, they're not going to support it.
And I don't know, Steve, if you've had clients that have come to you and discussed sort of change of use, for example, storage containers and how that's impacted their business, because it's not just a case of changing the purpose. There's obviously other implications that follow too.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Laura. And I think with all of these projects, they take a long time to come to fruition. Depends on the size and the nature, of course. But certainly where we've had some fairly significant changes announced in Budget 2024 about inheritance tax, for example, where you've got some of those diversification projects coming on stream. It's probably quite important just to think about where the value is going to sit longer term. It may be that a change of ownership before you actually start getting into applying for any change of use planning, for example, might be the right thing to do while the values are particularly low, while it's still arguable that some of those assets are of agricultural use. So I think that's probably the first step, is really think about the long term. Who's going to be the beneficial owners almost of this new project, and is it going to be something that we might want to, for example, move down a generation now before we add a lot more value into it. But that of course then comes with other implications as well. You've got to think then about who's going to fund it. It's no good passing an old red brick barn down a generation and say, well, there you go, there's the barn, now fund the development costs and the conversion costs on that. So I think it's just thinking about who's going to be the right person to own this going forward, and of course you need to have the enthusiasm to carry out and develop that work, but also then to manage it going forward as well.
And in terms of the tax implications, are there things that our clients need to be considering with this?
Oh, yeah, of course there is.
Stupid question, really, I know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, tax plays into everything, unfortunately, and again, the ownership point can have implications around inheritance tax planning, capital gains tax planning. Again, if you want to move assets around the family, for example, and then you start to get into some of the implications for more direct taxes. Income tax, who's going to pay the tax on the profits that hopefully these projects generate? Are we going to sell them? Is it going to be something that's retained for the long term? So again, we just need to manage that. And of course, our favourite VAT is always a play here in terms of, probably one of the questions that clients always ask is, can I get the VAT back? Mm-hmm. And, again, it's then just a case of looking at the particular project there. I'm not going to go into the detail because it's far too much for today, but partial exemption is one consideration which could restrict the input VAT recovery. And we look at options to tax on property for VAT to make sure that clients can recover the VAT. Clearly, if we can get 20% VAT back, if it's attracting a standard rate charge, then of course that makes a big difference in the amount that you've got to fund for the project in the first place.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that there is a VAT podcast coming as well, which covers a little bit of that.
I thought there might be. I sort of lined that one up for you. So
you did. Thank you very much. Yeah, you can come again. And day-to-day expense, there's business rates. It's not just the tax, there's other costs associated with these matters too. And I think that sometimes does get a little bit forgotten about in the background.
I think with any project, isn't it, you've got to do a full, if it's a sizable project, you need a sort of full sort of assessment, really, isn't it? Maybe a business plan might be too much. Maybe depending on the size of the development, you might have to be thinking about a business plan, and that will cover, as I say, all these things about ownership, how you're going to fund it, and make sure you've got the right structure in place for the long term as well.
And having good advisors on your side is also very important.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, Laura. I mean, it's surprising how long. I think Emma touched on this as well. It can take quite a long time to go through these processes in terms of putting together a proper project plan, applying for the right permissions, thinking about the ownership structure. It takes an awful long time. So I think that's just one thing not to overlook in terms of any of these projects. Speak to your advisors early. Think about how you're going to approach it early, because it will take an awful long time.
And get the advisors working together too, so everyone's on the same page.
Oh, that's absolutely right. The silo mentality of trying to keep your advisors separate, I just don't think works. I think we've talked about the planning side of things here, the tax side of things. Of course, you've got to think about other people that might have an interest as well. There might be some legal input that you need in terms of property ownership or moving it around the family. You've also got to think about banks as well. There's quite a lot of these properties that have got the charge over for current bank financing. So again, if we're going to move ownership, we might need the bank to release charges on property. So again, that is not a 5 minute, 5 minutes to sort that out. That can take several months to sort out. So if you want to do something and want to do it quickly, you might have to think again, I'm afraid.
Would you agree, Emma?
Yeah, I think especially now, I mean, we're a big advocate of everyone working together as a team, but especially as we're being asked more questions about whole farmyard redevelopment and diversification and the importance of those tax implications now, it's even more important that you have a good team, you have engaged early, and that all your team are working together. Because it's all very well us advising what might be possible from a planning and architecture perspective, but without input from your accountant, they might say, well, actually, have you thought about this? And we'll go, oh, actually, we could do that if that would help you and that's more beneficial. It's important for the framing so that you're all working from the same page and you're on the right footing from the start, because there's very little point in pursuing a costly and time intensive planning application if you get to the end of it and the rest of your wider team say, what have you done that for?
And then that's just a waste of time and money for everyone involved when we could have saved that from the start.
Exactly.
And I think that's a fair point, Laura, isn't it? You working together might sound costly when you've got all the professionals sitting around the table. When you look at the hourly rate, but I think longer term it can save. Where you've got that collaboration, working together between the various professionals. I think it's worthwhile doing.
I think I'm seeing it a lot more in my day-to-day job than I would have done a few years ago, and I think clients are now starting to understand the benefit, efficiencies, cost, time, like we said, compared to the daunting idea of having everyone in one room.
And I think you're obviously going to do another podcast on VAT, but that's one area particularly where we often see horror stories where clients have done certain things and we only find out about it when we're doing the sort of year-end accounts because they haven't kept us in the loop. And we are then scrapping around trying to put a case together to mean that they can recover the VAT. On a fairly sizable project, that can be quite significant numbers. So really important to think through all of those different aspects throughout.
Yeah, best to be proactive rather than reactive.
Definitely.
And I think it might be interesting, Emma, for our listeners, if you could give a bit of an insight to some of the things that you've been involved in.
So we do a wide range of planning applications here, from quite small to quite big. We do a lot of just your simple agricultural buildings. We have a big agricultural business consultancy team, and so we have a lot of that applications to support grant funding, etc. Increasingly, especially over the last 12 months, we're seeing much more interest around whole farmyard redevelopment. So either to cover historic debts or to assist with a kind of reorganization or a kind of separation of a business or a complete exit, so that there is a plan there. And so that's kind of thinking about what might be possible under full planning or permitted development and how we might stage applications so that we can get a better long-term value out of the site. So we're doing several of those projects at the moment. Also, a lot of wider farmyard redevelopment in terms of the repurposing of traditionally constructed buildings. So most farms have got a traditional constructed building or two, and they're just no longer fit for purpose. It's important that those buildings are maintained and retained, because once lost, they lose all of their value. They're of no good to you. If you've just got some foundations or one or two walls left, we can't really utilise that from a planning perspective. But obviously they're costly to maintain if they're not generating an income. And so we're seeing, especially as people are looking to diversify revenue streams, many more people taking note of those buildings and seeking to put them into kind of a more purposeful use, particularly commercial development, so that they can be retained and generate income moving forwards. We're looking again at a lot of that. And then we've got, the ad hoc class Q developments, whether that's one building or several buildings, especially under the new permitted development rights, where we could be getting permission for up to 10 dwellings. We've recently done one. We've got permission for up to 7 across 2 buildings to facilitate a retirement and overall exit from farming. and we're now putting it out to the market for developers with the aim probably of seeking a fallback permission. So going back in with another application to seek the demolition of the modern buildings and the erection of new dwellings in their place, on the basis that we're going to be securing an enhancement in terms of amenity, design, landscape, heritage, etc. And we do a lot of those projects, the Class Q, with a look to then doing a fallback application. And we work with a couple of developers who've essentially made it their entire business now, pretty much, is taking on those sites with the Class Q, doing the fallback application and delivering 4 or 5 really nice houses in places otherwise you just wouldn't get planning permission for them. So we've got a broad range, but yeah, the Class Q to fallback, the complete farmyard redevelopment, and the smaller diversification schemes. I mean, dog fields. We've done a lot of dog fields in the last 12 months.
That does not surprise me at all. I'm seeing them everywhere at the moment.
Yeah, I think we're having, an inquiry a week, a fortnight for a dog field, and they're great. They come with their challenges, but yeah, we're seeing a lot more of those projects now than I think we probably were 12 or 24 months ago.
And there must become a saturation of the market problem when you've got a dog field a week being inquired just through your firm. So
yeah, very, very much so. And I think we're definitely noticing that with the applications that go in, that they are increasingly challenging compared to even 6 months ago. The councils are slightly more cautious.
Is that, Emma, because once you've got that change of use permission there, can that then be extended later on? Is that part of the thinking there at all?
I think potentially so. I think they're seeing more, and so more and more people are concerned about it. Parish councils, local residents. I think more so we're seeing them slightly more separated from settlements as well, and the Highways Authority are taking slightly more concern over the traffic impact associated with those. Also, the biodiversity net gain requirements, they trigger that as a change of use of agricultural land. So there's lots of things to think about with those applications. It's not as simple as saying I want to change this field to a dog walking paddock, sticking up some fence and off you go. There's quite a lot to think about.
I've seen that as well with wedding venues, or our clients that have diversified into weddings, and they've had a lot of concern with residents, and that's played a big part in how well their application has gone.
They're not statutory consultees, but residents' views are important in directing case officers and statutory consultees where those issues might arise, especially around local drainage issues, amenity, highways issues. If enough neighbours are saying we've got a real concern about this, of course a case officer is going to look at that with more scrutiny, and then there's going to be a higher threshold for demonstrating that the issues wouldn't arise.
So if we had clients coming to both of you and they were asking for some practical do's and don'ts, what would your advice be?
I'll let you take that one first, Stephen.
Thank you. So practical do's and don'ts. I think, as I said before, Laura, I think it's about looking at the overall project. Why are you doing it in the first place? I understand that why. Emma's already referred to a number of different reasons why people are looking at some of these projects. Whether that's to create some diversified income, create some more income stream to the existing business. Is it looking at setting up perhaps another family member in a different line of the business than perhaps the core farming? So again, it may be that you're starting to carve out a commercial property letting business that maybe goes one way down the family, and maybe there's an obvious son or daughter that might be wanting to do the farming side of things. So again, that's a way of looking at it, and it's about just understanding that why you're doing that project in the first place. Is it an exit from the business that you're trying to set up, so that actually there's some more capital growth there and value added into the mix. So I think you've really got to understand why you want to do it. Some of these diversified projects take an awful lot of time. They're very, very different than perhaps the traditional farming business. you're suddenly starting to operate businesses where you're managing people, that's very different. Managing the sort of retail customers or sort of managing the public entering onto your land, again, you really, really think about it and be happy that that's something that you want to do going forward before you start to think about a change of use or a different type of project. So yeah, just think it through very carefully before you dive in.
I think from my perspective, those are really important, thinking about why you're doing it and what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. That's really important from our perspective as well. Very much don't expect it to be a simple and quick process. Inevitably there will be complications along the way beyond those that we've even anticipated, and these things take time and they are complicated, but it is important that we try and work those through prior to the submission of a planning application, because it's easier to deal with a lot of those before we get to that stage. Do engage with specialist team early on. Get some advice as soon as you can, once you think you've got an idea there, and get their views and help flesh that out, because the chances are if you come with what you think is a fully fledged scheme, someone is going to pop your balloon, unfortunately, and it might not be as rosy as you think, and so it's important to engage with appropriate specialists to kind of talk that through and make sure you get something that works. And a big one for me, like I mentioned, if you've got existing buildings, do look after them as much as you can without breaking the bank, because in 5 years when you come to think about doing it and you've got just 3 walls left instead of a roof and 4 walls, that's a very different proposition from a planning perspective. So kind of looking after the assets you've got within reason is a really big one, because once they're gone, there's not a lot we can do with that, I'm afraid.
So being prepared, having your advisors, and being very patient is key.
Yeah.
Emma, you mentioned B&G earlier. Clearly, environmental impact is a very big concern at the moment. Could you expand a bit more on that for us?
Yeah, of course. So B&G, or biodiversity net gain, became a mandatory requirement for many planning applications early part of last year. So in really simple terms, any development that triggers the requirement for B&G, you need to have a baseline survey of your site undertaken, which tells you which habitats that you've got on site. So that's kind of main habitats, hedges and trees, and then watercourse. It takes a baseline value. You plug in what development you're doing, and then it tells you how much habitat value you've lost across your site as a result of that. And then you have to show that you can get back to your original baseline value and then up 10% as a result of the development. And that's across habitats, the hedgerows, and the watercourse units where applicable. And so most occasions that B&G assessment needs to be undertaken by a fully qualified ecologist, and they need to complete the metric for you. And where you're doing a smaller site, then that just needs to be undertaken by someone who's capable of identifying the habitats on site. So in our instance, that's a number of our environmental team here have the capability to do that and fill in that metric for us. So I think most of us have got our heads around it now, and the impacts that it's having on development. So I think we're probably finding that it's got a little bit more impact on the smaller sites opposed to the bigger sites, where it's slightly less easy to deliver that uplift on site. And so there is a possibility of purchasing credits and delivering that elsewhere, or delivering it on land within your control, but not within your application site. But there's lots of things to think about there. There's a tie-in for 30 years, at which point, because you've then got to meet biodiversity net gain requirements, it's unlikely you're going to be able to just strip that out and develop it anywhere that you've delivered such uplift. You also have to secure maintenance and monitoring for 30 years, and there's a whole program in place for that. So it's a relatively complicated, elongated, and potentially costly development consideration, particularly for smaller sites. And I think in some instances, we have found that it has had a greater impact than we'd really anticipated, particularly for a couple of rural diversification schemes that we've looked at. It's not triggered by prior notification applications, so your Class Qs, your Class R installation of solar under PD, but it is triggered by any application that you need a full planning permission for, unless you meet one of the exemptions around self-build or you're only affecting a really small area of habitat. And so actually we've seen it impact quite a lot of solar developments because they count the whole thing as a loss and you need to offset that somewhere. So lots of things to think about there. We also have considerations around nutrient neutrality. So I know that doesn't impact everywhere, but obviously it does impact quite heavily in East Anglia. And that's really around residential development and the creation of new overnight accommodation. So mostly new residential dwellings. And where you're within that affected area, showing that your development wouldn't result in a net increase in the release of nutrients to protected waterways, so particularly the kind of Broads area, River Wensum, Bure, yeah. And so in those instances, again, an assessment is done. You plug it into a lovely little spreadsheet, you tell it what the existing use is, you tell it what you're proposing to do, and it tells you how much additional nitrate or phosphate you might be releasing into those waterways. You can then either purchase offset credits from Norfolk environmental credits we've got here, or a number of private ones are now popping up. Or, especially in rural areas, if you've got your own septic tanks or cesspits, you might have the ability to offset it yourself within your own control by upgrading those to a newer model package treatment plant, and that could then create enough headroom in the system to offset what you're doing. I think if you're thinking of doing any rural development, important to think about that. I know we've had a lot of particularly estate clients who've been approached by others proposing to do that for them. So they replace their septic tanks or cesspits for them, put the package treatment plants in, but then they're taking the benefit and selling it on to other people. And so if you've got what we think is development potential, sensible to think about that before you sign off your offset to someone else, because you don't want to do that and then find you're having to buy it back from them at a greater cost later down the line when you want to do some development. Also recently here, especially, Anglian Water have got some issues around water supply in terms of commercial development. So they're seeking to restrict new water supply to some commercial development because they've just not got enough water supply at the moment. They're working on some big reservoir schemes, but they are seeking to control daily water use for some commercial development. And for residential development, they've got some issues around foul capacity within the system. So it's been in the press recently as well that they're looking to control the approval or occupation of new residential dwellings in some areas where they've got identified capacity issues. That's a big and complicated subject, and I think there's still a lot of discussion ongoing and to be had around that, but it is going to factor into a lot of development in this area. And so it's something to be thinking about and engaging with consultants about, planning consultants and drainage consultants, about what the potential impact of that might be and whether it will in the short term restrict development opportunity or at least make that process slightly more complicated. So environmental considerations are a big one, on those on top of your normal ecology survey requirements. So most people will be aware, especially if we're talking about existing buildings, that bat surveys are a big one. If you've got an existing building, the chances are the council are going to want confirmation that you don't have bats in that building. And Natural England have increased the requirements around that and kind of changed the threshold of when you need bat surveys and you don't. And bat surveys can only be undertaken at certain times of the year. Same with Great Crested Newt surveys, although that's slightly less onerous than bats. And that's some of what the last minute amendments to the planning infrastructure bill are seeking to kind of overcome. with that nature recovery fund position is trying to make that less project specific and more a kind of pay a mitigation tariff and be on your way. So, but yes, increasingly environmental concerns are obviously a really big factor and very often a costly and time consuming one.
I didn't realise how complicated they actually could be. I've learned a lot.
It really is. It's very complicated.
And you summed up there, Emma, and said, again, coming back to the time that these things take as well. If there's P&G or nutrient neutrality, environmental considerations you're going to have to undertake, then some of those reports are, the timing of those in the seasons are important, as well as and the amount of time that they're just going to take to pull together is just going to add to that whole project plan again.
Very much so, yeah.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. So what might be nice to finish is perhaps like top 3 tips from both of you for our listeners.
So I go first. All right. So I think the first thing for me is coming back to the why. It's just to understand why you're undertaking the project, thinking about, have you got the ownership, the particular buildings or lands in the right place in the first instance, and just making sure that you apply enough time, set aside enough time so that you can actually pull all of this together. I think my second one is probably just thinking about the commerciality of the project. Think through what you're trying to achieve, but how you're going to achieve it, what does success look like at the end of it. Talking about business planning, talking about cash flow planning in terms of being able to fund the project and the timescale. In some of these cases, it's going to take quite a lot of time before you start to see income coming back in again. And then I think the third thing for me is really just thinking about tax analysis. Of course, I'll finish with that one, won't I? But
your favourite.
Literally every single tax I think will come into play. It's very easy to overlook some of them. So just make sure you undertake a full tax analysis of the project. Suddenly getting caught with stamp duty, land tax, or suddenly getting caught with VAT bill that you weren't expecting is something that you want to avoid.
So from my perspective, I think thinking about your aims and aspirations, what you're trying to achieve, whether we're exiting or continuing or diversifying revenue streams, all of those are important. We don't want to be proposing residential development in the middle of what's going to continue to be a working farmyard. Those things are important. Thinking long term, because we don't want to do something that seems like a great idea now but jeopardize something that you're thinking you might want to do in 5 to 10 years. It's really important to kind of think about how all of those things come together, because they do have an impact, and it might change the way that we advise you to do something, or the timing, the way that those go. And engage with experts and engage with them early, planning consultants, architects, wider team. Have those people on hand, a high level initial feasibility or master plan, kind of tying in your aims, aspirations, your wider thoughts over the next 5 to 10 years. I think it's really, really important, and it's really key to get a view on what might be possible and what you might have to think about early before you set off on a process that ends up in wasted time and money.
Well, Emma, Steve, I think it's been a brilliant 40 odd minutes. We've covered a lot, and I've certainly learned a lot myself, so thank you both for joining.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Emma.
And if any of our listeners have any questions or queries, then please do not hesitate to get in touch. Our contact information will be in the show notes.
Thank you for joining us for Larkin-Gowan Insights, Accountancy and Business Advice for All. Don't forget, you can find more information about today's topic and more about how our team of experts can help you in your business by visiting our website, larkin-gowan.co.uk. Join us again next time for another fascinating insight into the world of accounting and finance.